It's always a sad day when your favorite band calls it quits. And so in 1991, when it was announced that Rob Halford was leaving Judas Priest, well, quite frankly, I was crushed. Judas Priest was one of my favorite bands. But for every tragedy, a silver lining is formed. And over the next decade, some of the best heavy metal music of all time was created. Judas Priest, The Wilderness Years. Next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Tonight, we're going to take a look at one of the great heavy metal breakups, Judas Priest. Rob Halford and the boys called it quits in 1991. Now, Judas Priest will continue on, but without Rob Halford. We'll get to more of that in a second. The fact of the matter is, there's kind of two parts to this story. The first part is, well, why did Judas Priest break up in the first place? Now, one thing that I would like to point out is when you are a band, you have a lot of pressure on you. And so both mental and physical pressure takes its toll. And if you remember back to the Judas Priest story, right before Painkiller comes out in 1990, the band goes through a horrific trial in which they were accused of murdering two of their fans by putting hypnotic messages in the song Beyond the Realms of Death. Now listen, it's one thing to be accused of murder and stand trial. That's stressful enough because, face it, no matter what your innocence is, you never know what's going to happen. You get a jury that's in a bad mood or, has some preconceived notions, and you could be in big trouble. And secondly, the situation surrounding that whole trial, the tragic death of those two young boys was horrific as well. So there's am I going to jail for the rest of my life? Having to deal with the story of these two kids, really, you could tell, put a lot of mental stress on Judas Priest. And many people say that the reason Painkiller was so angry and dark and just all that rage gets unleashed is because of that mental stress. The second is you start getting into, physical toll of touring constantly. There's an infamous story at the very end of the Painkiller tour. They're in Toronto, Canada, and for one of the big encores, Rob Halford, of course, rides out on his Harley. Well, they had a very complicated stage setup back in the days when we talk about heavy metal in the 80s, we were always, you talk about stage productions, just all sorts of moving parts and pieces. Well, one of those moving parts and pieces just happened to whack Rob Halford, knock him off his motorcycle, knock him unconscious, knock him to the ground. Now, at the time, there's all this dry ice on the stage, so the band is wondering, where the hell is Rob, right? They don't see him laying there, and Glenn Tipton tells almost, we can look at back now and laugh, but the funny story of him kind of trying to figure out where Rob is and practically tripping over the body. But anyway, so I think Rob Halford had a lot of mental stress from that trial, a lot of physical stress from being on the tour, on a very long, successful tour. And so Rob Halford decides to call it quits. Now, a lot of, you talk to Judas Priest now, the whole thing was just a big misunderstanding, never any animosity. No one was really ever wanted to quit. So, there's a little bit of vagueness to what actually happened. But bottom line is, Judas Priest, as we knew it, was no more. But as I said in the opener, there is always a silver lining to these things. And we're about to be introduced to a string of albums that is absolutely excellent. So we're going to take a look at post Judas Priest breakup. I call this the Judas Priest Wilderness Edition. And we're going to talk about some of those albums because in some cases, because Judas Priest gets back together in 2003, the Wilderness Years kind of brushed over, kind of hidden in the sands of time. So you may not be familiar with all the albums we're about to talk about, and that's a darn shame. Let's rectify that situation. So first and foremost, What happens with Rob Halford after the big breakup? So at this point in Rob Halford's life, he's living in Phoenix, Arizona. And he just happens to be talking to his tattoo artist, who just happens to be a musician. Well, one thing leads to another, and the band Fight is formed. I personally think Fight is one of the most underrated bands in heavy metal history, and a band that you may not have ever heard of. If you take one thing away from this video, go listen to Fight. They are tremendous. Well, they put out an album in 1993 called War of Words that is one of my favorite albums of all time. That's how much I think of it. Now, one of the things that we sometimes hear when someone leaves a band, they go off and form another band that sounds just like the band they left. But that's not the case here. Rob Halford sees the writing on the wall. Heavy metal is yesterday's news. It's not very popular. So he forms a band that sounds completely different from Judas Priest. What do they sound like? Well, it's kind of hard to describe. But they do have that traditional heavy metal for sure. Rob Halford brings that to the table. But they also have a big, heavy dose of groove metal. Groove metal being very popular in the day. Maybe one of the best known bands of that time. Pantera was a groove metal band. And just throw in a dash of nu metal, which was also quite the rage at the time. That is kind of what Fight sounds like. And it starts off right off the bat. Into the Pit is a ferocious album opener that really blends all these styles really good. It breaks into my favorite Fight song, Nailed to the Gun. And again, this brings that heavy metal vocal styling of Rob Halford, a lot of that rhythmic crunchiness of nu metal, and just that groove that comes in. This is, if you're going to listen to one Fight song, in my humble opinion, it's right here with Nailed to the Gun. Now, if you are a big fan of Rob Halford's vocals, as I am, I think the next song that you would take a look is For All Eternity, kind of a slower, maybe a ballad type song, but Halford sings the heck out of it. Another song on this album of note, Little Crazy. I think the band was really trying to push this one. This was one of the singles they released off this album. Fun song, kind of shows a maniacal side of Rob Halford, really good. That is a song to listen to. But if you want a deep track, I love the song Contortion. Big, heavy, crunchy, distorted riffs. Such a departure from Judas Priest. You know, when you think about the birth of heavy metal, you know, you had Tony Iommi, you had Sabbath doing those big, crunchy riffs, but Judas Priest was a departure from that. They were more about the speed and blazing guitar solos. This is such a departure for Halford, and they pulled off. Not only are there just big, distorted riffs throughout this thing, but it just builds in intensity and kind of has a really cool crescendo where all those riffs kind of come together, kind of like a molten volcano just finally erupting at the end of the song. One of my favorites. If you're looking for a deep track, try Contortion. Like I said, I can go through this whole album. It is excellent. One of my favorite albums of all time. It seemed like Fight really had something going. Saw him in concert, put on a great show. You could almost detect that Fight was going to be big. But then came their second album. In 1995, Judas Priest followed up the excellent War of Words album with their sophomore album, Small Deadly Space, and it was a flop. I think me and some family members were the only thing that bought this sucker. And I have a theory as to why. Let me show you visually what not to do if you're trying to sell yourself as a heavy metal band. You'll see to the album over here to my left, you will see a beautiful logo that was displayed prominently on War of Words. One of my favorite trinkets from my heavy metal concert days, I got to see these guys in concert, and I got a Fight pin to put on Battle Jacket that was just, look at that iconic logo. It's kind of like Iron Maiden found Eddie. You don't mess with Eddie. Now, 2 years later, you put out this, A Small Deadly Space. Now, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, what happened to the logo? Is this even the same band? I was at a record store. I find this thing. I didn't even know Fight had a new album. Clearly. I see this, and I'm sitting here going, is this the Fight? Because it has no resemblance to the prior album. So that's problem number one. Now, if you think I'm making this up, they later fixed it, because then they made the album look more like that. There's the logo. That's what you do. When you have a great logo, stick with it. Don't be messing with it, because it just confuses your fans. We didn't have the internet back then. I'm looking at this thing and I'm going, I think this is the band I love, but I literally took it home and put it on, and when I heard Halford's voice, I was like, whew, it is them, right? But it was a little bit weird. Secondly, the album itself, we talked about War of Words, right? What do we say? It's kind of a combination between heavy metal, groove metal, and nu metal. Now, on this album, there's really no nu metal at all. Groove metal, very slight. I heard one person say this was them kind of moving towards grunge, which of course was the big art form of the day. But I really liken this to just that sludgy, stoner, like psychedelic metal. Really a departure, even from their first album. Once again, Rob Halford's all over the board. He is just experimenting with different sounds. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. So they go from this really heavy, crunchy sound to, like I said, this kind of psychedelic, sludgy, slower paced metal album. If you're looking for big, bombastic, heavy songs that move fast, this is not for you. The second problem with this album, in my humble opinion, is the first of the album is pretty weak. I don't really care for it. If I was to recommend listening to this album, I'm going to start at track 5, Never Again. Big, distorted riffs on that one. And then it really kicks into one of my favorite songs in the entirety of the Fight catalog. The title track, Small Deadly Space, has a very eerie vibe to it. I really, really dig this song. Greta Green's fine, nothing to write home about. But then, Beneath the Violence, I think this is probably my favorite track on the entire album. And it's kind of funny because I pulled the track listing up on Spotify, and it's the least listened to song on the entire album, which I think is a huge mistake. One of the things I always try to do is visualize things when listening to a song. And this talks about, this like Arctic tundra wasteland type thing that this person's going through. It always kind of reminded me of the Frankenstein movies. Not the old black and white movies, but the more modern day true adaptations of the book where the Frankenstein's monster goes up to the Arctic and Dr. Frankenstein's up there pursuing him. Kind of gives me that kind of vibe. Really cool, visualization for that one. Human Crate. So very good. And then finally, a little bit of a ballad in A World of My Own Making. Very similar, kind of a Fight version of the song Beyond the Realms of Death. Kind of has that same vibe. Really good. And then again, I don't know what it was in the 80s and 90s, what we were doing. But then there was like a bonus track. For some reason, someone thought, what a great marketing idea. After the album ends, we're going to give the listener like 2 minutes of silence. And then we're going to break into another song. Like, were we trying to irritate the listener? You don't have to worry about that if you pull this up on Spotify or whatever, because they just put it in the next track. But Psycho Suicide, like, might be the best song on the album. Like, it's finally got some real pep to it. It's fast, it's heavy, it's vicious. Why would you put this as your bonus track? This thing has so many mistakes, right? Terrible album cover. Don't keep the same logo. No one knows what's going on. You start the album off terribly, and then you put, perhaps, at least in competition for the best track on the album, in this weird hidden track after you left the first 10 songs behind, and you give the poor listener 2 minutes of silence before you break into this hidden track. Terrible marketing, terrible ideas all around. This album, War of Words, I think objectionably is the better of the two albums. I don't think there's any comparison. But in a weird sense, War of Words has some of my favorite tracks. It's kind of one of those, like, it may not be as good, but it's closer to my heart. I probably listen to songs off this album even more than War of Words. So I don't quite recommend this because, again, if you don't like sludgy stoner metal, you probably won't like this. It took a while for me to kind of get in the groove of things. And like I said, you have to get through the first part of the album. But if you really want to give this a try, I do think you might learn to love it. The last, like I said, 5 or 6 tracks are absolutely fantastic. So, Fight puts out War of Words. I have no problems recommending that one. Again, more of a heavy metal, groove metal, nu metal combo. Then they break into Small Deadly Space, much more mellow, much more psychedelic stoner metal, but has some really great songs on the latter half of the album. And then, just as quickly as Fight came onto the scene, they were gone. There's Mutations. There was a couple of compilations in there. They've since released a new compilation called the rehearsal tracks, where they play a lot of the War of Words album with some songs that didn't make the album that I've been listening to. But for the most part, 2 songs and they're done. Now, Rob Halford's going to continue trying different styles of heavy metal music. Let's see what he does next. In 1997, Rob Halford forms a new band, TWO. And this time, Rob Halford is going to put out an album that is industrial metal. Now, I have no problems with bands experimenting with their sounds, experimenting with styles. A lot of times you find some really good stuff. We just talked about the fact that both of those Fight albums had very different styles and sounds. But I think Rob Halford finally found a style that just didn't fit him. Industrial metal was not his cup of tea. The album in 1997 is called Voyeurs. I have tried on several occasions to listen to this album to give it, a fair critique. One of the things that I kind of do when I listen, I have to listen to a lot of music. There's so much good music coming out. You have to try to weed through the stuff you don't like to get to the stuff you do like. And so I kind of do this on streaming shows and on heavy metal albums. I'll give you like a 3-track try, and after 3 tracks, if I'm just not feeling it, I usually move on. Never have gotten past the 3-track style. I don't think I've ever been completely through this album. I just, after a couple of songs, I'm ready to pitch it and give up on it. So if you are a huge Rob Halford fan and you say, wait a minute, metal dude, Voyeurs is actually a very good album. You just got to know what songs to pull up. By all means, put your suggestions in the comments below, because I've never been able to get enthused about it. Like I said, I'll try a couple songs here and there, and I end up just giving up and moving on. Don't like it. Have never really given it a full try. One of the things I'll say about Small Deadly Space is, I think when I first got it, I liked a couple songs right off the bat, don't get me wrong, but I think the album grew on me the more I listened to it, because of the, I call them anchor songs that anchor you into the album, so you then listen to the whole album because there's a few songs you want to listen to, and then you kind of find other songs that you like along the way. So it's kind of an unfair advantage to take an album that you've listened to thousands of times versus one that I've never owned this album. I saw it when I got Spotify. I'm like, oh, I've never really tried the industrial Rob Halford. So I never owned the album. So it's probably unfair, but I just don't think that's what Rob Halford should be doing. When it comes to the album Voyeurs, probably the less said, the better. But Rob Halford is going to bounce back in a big way. All right, no more industrial metal, no more stoner metal, no more groove metal, new metal. Rob Halford finally returns to the traditional heavy metal world with a brand new album, Resurrection, and a brand new band, Halford, and a new collaborator in arms, a fellow by the name of Roy Z. Now, why do I want to talk about Roy Z for a second? Is he's also the collaborator on many of the Bruce Dickinson solo albums. So when you talk about some of the great Bruce Dickinson albums, and even recently Bruce Dickinson's Mandrake project, Roy Z, a famous collaborator. Speaking of Bruce Dickinson, we're going to talk about him in just a second. But let's talk about this return to form. Halford's triumphant return. This album has that triumphant return kind of vibe. It starts off with the excellent Resurrection. I think this might be one of the best Halford songs in their catalog. Such a great beginning, such a great message. I'm back, I'm ready to go. He follows that up with Made in Hell, another kind of triumphant return type of song where he talks about, being, out in that wilderness, but he's back. Now, I will say, Locked and Loaded, the third song on here, I do wonder if this is a song he wrote during his Fight era, because it does. This is the one song on the entire album that kind of has that old groove feel that Fight had. Lots of great songs. Speaking of Bruce Dickinson, though, the one you love to hate, Bruce Dickinson and Rob Halford together, two of the most legendary singers in the history of heavy metal doing a duet, and the song is really good as well. Now, the back half of the album is not nearly as good as the front half, but there's a couple of pretty good songs on there. I do like Silent Screams. I do like Slow Down. And the final song on here, Savior. All pretty good songs, but all together, this album has so much energy. And you know how we talked about when a singer leaves the band, they kind of form another band that sounds like the old band. This sounds like Priest. This is really great. And we're going to get one more. Halford and the Boys would return in 2002 with their second album, Crucible. Now, similar to what we talked about when we talked about Fight, I don't think Crucible is nearly as good of an album as their first album, Resurrection, but it does have some interesting points to it. Number one, it is much heavier than the previous album. And I think the reason being is the very first album was like the triumphant return of Rob Halford. Very uplifting, very exciting. This is a much darker, more somber album. This is a lot of anger in this album. And you can see it by some of the titles. Betrayal, The Wrath of God, just a couple of the tunes here. And one person I want to bring up here, and I think one of the reasons this album is so much more heavy, I really like the drumming work of I got to get this guy. This guy's got one of those names, Bobby Jarzombic. And the minute I saw that name, I knew this guy had been doing some great drumming for the band Riot for years. He shows up on this one, and the drums are just savage on this album. So I really like it. Again, I don't think I like it nearly as much, but I do appreciate the heavy thunder that comes off of this album. Now, this is the last album Halford's going to do before he reunites with Judas Priest in 2003. I do want to point out that Halford is going to put out 2 more albums post his reunion with Judas Priest. The third one, of all things, is like a Christmas album. Go figure. If you want to hear Rob Halford sing Christmas carols, you got to go to the band Halford, go to that third album, and let your Christmas fantasies go wild. There you go. But this would be the last one that truly lives within the wilderness period. Of all the albums that Rob Halford did, I think easily for me, War of Words would come in first. I think the first Halford Resurrection comes in second. Small Deadly plays easily into third. And then, of course, we have this bad boy right here, Crucible, and then finally Voyeur. Now, while Rob Halford's been busy making 5 albums, Judas Priest has been taking their time forming their big comeback. Let's see what Judas Priest is up to. Judas Priest took their sweet time getting together. They don't put out their first album until 1997. By this point, Rob's already been in Fight and left Fight before Judas Priest ever got off the ground. Now, one of the problems Judas Priest had was how do you replace a legendary singer like Rob Halford? And they found the replacement in one of the oddest ways possible. They found Tim Ripper Owens in Akron, Ohio, who was part of a Judas Priest cover band. You can't make this up. They even made kind of a schmaltzy movie about it called Rockstar. Mark Wahlberg and Jennifer Aniston were in it, I believe. But it's quite the story. Here's Judas Priest, this great legendary band. They're looking for replacements. They could go to any heavy metal band around and say, hey, you want to be our singer? But instead, they found a guy that sounded just like Rob Halford. Tim Ripper Owens is one of the most phenomenal singers you're ever going to hear. He steps in and it sounds tremendous. So, 1997, 6 years after Rob Halford's exit, they put out Jugulator. Now, I've noticed over the years that Judas Priest doesn't really acknowledge this album's existence. It's out of print. It's nowhere to be found. You don't see it on Spotify. They don't play any of the songs off it in concert, obviously, for various reasons. It's like the Tim Ripper Owens era didn't really exist. But for some reason, they kind of semi-acknowledged the second album, Demolition. Jugulator is just like persona non grata for whatever reason. And that's a shame, because just like we talked with Fight, and just like we talked with Halford, Judas Priest is going to put together 2 albums. And their first one, Jugulator, is by far their strongest. It's very interesting. Judas Priest breaks up. And as I said when I was talking about Rob Halford, the singer leaves and puts together a band that sounds just like the other band, and the band stays together with a band that sounds just like what they were. But in this case, Halford goes off and makes an album that doesn't sound anything like Judas Priest. Judas Priest brings in a new lead singer and then puts out this album that doesn't sound like anything previously done by Judas Priest. I don't know how they did it. Jugulator is a very... I don't mean this in a negative way. It's a very odd album. Very hard to describe, but it does not sound like Judas Priest. And one of the main reasons is the songwriting, of course, not having Halford in the room writing the songs. The songs tend to be a little bit more basic, I would say, from a songwriting perspective. But again, sounds very different. Now, I love a number of songs in here. I love Dead Meat. I love Death Row. One of the best songs in the entire Ripper Owens catalog, Burn in Hell, one of my absolute favorites. They have the song Bullet Train that actually got nominated for a Grammy for Best Heavy Metal Performance. Very good song. Love me some Bullet Train. But all of those pale in comparison to the final number on the album, Cathedral Spires. Not only is that the best song in the entire Ripper Owens catalog, I would put it easily in one of my top 10 favorite Judas Priest songs, regardless of singer. It is sensational. There is a great intro to it, kind of a soft intro, but basically you're setting up this whole thing of, I love the line, we're about to see our last setting sun. Time to rise up and ascend. The end has come. And this was right about the time the Titanic movie came out. And I remember in the Titanic movie, they were talking about as the old lady is recounting what happened, that Titanic was about to see the last time they would see sunlight, because of course that night is when they hit the iceberg. Kind of the same kind of thing is your impending doom is happening. The last time you're going to see the sun set before your doom. Great, great song. This album is hard to find, but it is worth it. It is very different from all the other Judas Priest albums, but if you find it, go in there. Again, go directly to Cathedral Spires. If you're only going to try one song, I think it's phenomenal. But Burn in Hell, Bullet Train, Dead Meat, Death Row, they're all really sensational songs. I think this is one of those albums, for whatever reason, didn't get nearly enough credit, but I think Judas Priest gets their new age going with a sensational album. In 2001, Judas Priest puts out their next album with Tim Ripper Owens, Demolition. And this album flopped. Once again, it's so strange. Halford puts out 2 albums with Fight. First one's good, the second one flopped. Puts out 2 albums with Halford. First one's great, the second one's, it's okay. Here we come to Judas Priest, their first album, pretty good. The second one, once again, a flop. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I think the biggest reason is that this album is just way too long. Judas Priest had way too much material, and you kind of get lost in the shuffle when you put something together. While Jugulator was a very good 10-song album, came in under an hour, this 13 tracks, over 70 minutes. For those of you who weren't around during this period, let me just say this. When I first started listening to heavy metal music, I listened to it on vinyl. And vinyl had some limitations. You really weren't going to get more than 9 or 10 songs on a vinyl album. It just wouldn't fit. So then we get into the CD era, and it seemed like everybody was just trying to put as many tracks, like now that we have the capability, let's do this thing. Let's put as many tracks on there. 13 tracks, over 70 minutes. Listen, if you got 13 good songs to share with the world, I'm all for it. But in this case, they did not. And so a lot of people have panned this album, but a lot of the reason is because of its length. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some really good tracks on here. Hell is Home is kind of a fun little number. Close to You, very good. Subterfuge, another good one. But my absolute favorite, and I would put it right up there with some of the best songs on Jugulator, I love the song Feed on Me. So again, it's a long album. It's got some snoozers in here, but you got to weed through them. Find the gems in here. It's well worth it. Now, at this point, Judas Priest has put out 2 albums. Halford's been in 3 different bands at this point. And luckily for us, this was the end of the wilderness period. In 2003, Judas Priest is going to come back together and start putting out some of the best music of their career. If you haven't heard later stages Judas Priest, 2003 on, their big comeback, Angel Retribution on, do yourself a favor. Go listen to some of these Wilderness albums. I think they're very underrated, but go listen to the reunited Judas Priest. We'll be talking a lot about them. As you know, we go through year by year, through the years of metal, talking about the best metal. And I guarantee you, when we get into the new form of Judas Priest, we're going to be talking a lot about those great albums. But that's our show. I really just wanted to put a little bit of a spotlight on some of these very underrated albums that came in through the Wilderness era. In particular, go check out War of Words if you've never seen it. In particular, go check out Resurrection by Halford. And by all means, it's hard to find, but go find Jugulator. You'll be glad you did. We do this every Tuesday. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss all this great content. Ring the bell, give it a thumbs up, feed the YouTube algorithm. And we're going to be back here next Tuesday, probably talking about the brand new Motionless in White album, so you don't want to miss it. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.